Good morning, everybody. We're going to kick off. I'm sorry that we're starting a few minutes late. We're experiencing a little bit of technical difficulty with Ambassador Mohamed, but we're working to get her online, but we thought we would just kick things off in the meanwhile. I'm looking at the numbers tick up. I know it takes a moment or two before everybody has fully joined, so I'm just going to make some brief introductions and talk about some things that we have coming up with WIT. Lisa Schroeder is going to moderate today, but we also have Emily Beeline, who's our incoming president next year, is going to introduce Ambassador Mohamed. But before she does, let me just welcome everybody who is a non-WIT member. We opened this up to non-WIT due to the popularity and of our guest speaker. And we welcome anybody who hasn't a member yet to join us. We are happy to be one of the most preeminent women's development organizations in DC with a membership of around 700. Oh, good morning, Ambassador. We're so glad to have you on.
Good morning.
I was just kicking things off just to let everybody into the room. But I will shorten my introduction so we can get going with you. Thanks to everybody also who's joined us from Kenya. I know that Lisa extended the invitation broadly, and we hope that we have some people from our sister organization, WIT in Nairobi, which is also a strong chapter. Before we introduce you, just wanted to also mention we're going to have an award ceremony virtually this year on September 24th, and we're excited to announce that later this week. We just decided we didn't want to let COVID stand in the way of honoring the excellent work of our members and other women in the field of international trade this year, so we're really delighted to go forward with that. But Ambassador Mohamed, we're so delighted to have you with us here today, not only because you're in the running as a top candidate for Director General of the WTO, but you have such an amazing, illustrious career, and I'm personally hoping that we're going to be able to hear some of your war stories, having chaired green room sessions and pulled rabbits out of your hat in Nairobi in that ministerial conference. And we love to share trade war stories and hear how you shepherded those processes so ably. So thank you for sharing your experiences with us today. I'm going to turn it over to Emily Beeline to do a proper bio introduction for you, and then we'll kick off.
Good morning, everyone. Hi, my name is Emily Beeline. I'm Senior Counsel at FedEx here in Washington, D.C., and I'm honored to introduce Dr. Mohamed. Ambassador Dr. Amina Mohamed is an accomplished international civil servant and diplomat who has served in various high-level international, regional, and national portfolios over the last 3 decades. She's a former Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, and has also previously served as Minister for Education, Science, and Technology. She's the current Minister for Sports, Cultural, and Heritage, and Kenya is a sports powerhouse and the leading Olympic medal winner in Africa. As Kenya's Foreign Affairs and International Trade Minister from 2013 to 2018, she chaired the 2015 WTO Ministerial Conference in Nairobi. As the first woman and first African to chair the WTO's highest forum, she played a crucial role in reaching positive outcomes, especially the decision to eliminate export subsidies in agriculture. She was Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and Deputy Executive Director of UNEP from 2011 to 2013, and helped advance its agenda to address contemporary challenges facing the organization. Ambassador Mohamed was the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Justice, National Cohesion, and Constitutional Affairs from 2008 to 2011. She was in charge of the constitutional review process that culminated in the promulgation of the 2010 Constitution of Kenya. From 2008 to 2011, she was Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Justice, National Cohesion, and Constitutional Affairs. From 2000 to 2006, Amina was Kenya's permanent representative and ambassador to the WTO. She was the first woman to chair the General Council in 2005 and the dispute settlement body. This is just a light selection of the 23 pages of a bio that we were given, and she has many other prominent accomplishments and a recipient of many awards. In all these roles, she has promoted development and diversity, particularly the education, social, and economic empowerment of women. And we are very proud to host her here today. So Lisa, over to you. Thank you for having us.
And Emily, you failed to mention that while doing all of that, She has 7 children.
Oh, I
That's
did think
the biggest accomplishment of all, is that you did all of that while having a massive, wonderful family.
Oh, congratulations.
Right, Emily, Andrea, thanks to you both for kicking us off. I'm Lisa Schroeder, the Global Director of Trade and Investment Policy for Dow, former WIT president, and actually current president of the WIT Trust, which is one of the reasons I'm so excited we were able to organize this discussion with you today, Your Excellency. This is such a great opportunity, I think, particularly for so many young women and some of us who are maybe a little bit more aged in our careers, but very excited about the opportunity to really demonstrate what women bring to the table in terms of encouraging truly progressive trade policy. Your bio, your career speaks for itself, but I gotta say, to Andrea's last point, any woman who can manage all of these jobs while raising 7 kids is perfectly capable of managing all of the personalities at the World Trade Organization. So we'd welcome your opening comments, your thoughts on what that agenda should be, what kind of leadership the WTO really needs to take it into the next decade. A quick reminder for everybody in the audience, after the minister's opening remarks, we will have an interactive Q&A. I know from experience, the minister's very interested in our thoughts and ideas. So please feel free to submit either through Q&A or chat your ideas, suggestions, and especially your questions as we think about the discussion. So Madam Minister, Madam Ambassador, over to you.
Well, thank you very, very much, Lisa. How much time do I have for the opening statements?
We would welcome your comments for as long as you'd like to talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Let me just say I'm really grateful to the Organization of Women in International Trade and Andrea, Emily, and Lisa for organizing this webinar, for giving me an opportunity to talk about women in international trade, but also about my candidacy to be the next WTO Director General. Now, before turning to WTO and what more it can be doing to promote gender inclusiveness and empowerment, I would like to look at the economic and social impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on women and how it has disproportionately affected women. And let me just begin by saying that it has truly exposed the many iniquities faced by women in business and international trade. Now, I think there's no doubt that women have been the ones on the front line in facing this pandemic and in performing critical roles to keep our societies safe and functioning. Now, according to the ILO, women, and I think many young women, are overwhelmingly employed in healthcare and social work, in retail and wholesale, and education and hospitality sectors. And this is around the world, in all our countries. And these are the sectors that are least likely to have employees be able to work from home and have been put at the risk of the pandemic. Women have also been impacted by the rise of working from home. And I think while many say that the use of technology and working from home can be the great equalizer, we must also face the fact that it has not been easy for many. And before looking at the inequities of the digital divide, we must look at the disproportionate pressures that have been placed on women with regard to childcare and other household responsibilities, while also trying to participate in Zoom or Teams calls to perform their jobs. And I know that any young woman out there would understand what I was talking about. I don't have the same challenge right now, but I know that even as they try to get on Zoom, they'll have their children wanting to be close to their mothers. I mean, it's not every day. It's just, I think, as a result of the pandemic that you have your mother at home the whole day, all hours. And we all know that our children like to be close to their mothers. And so as you perform these duties, you'll have children, coming, wanting to sit on your lap, wanting to be part of your conversations as they would normally be. So that has been actually additional pressure that has been put on women, making it, I think, much more difficult to achieve the objectives and goals that they have set for themselves. Now to the international trade aspects. Despite evidence showing that businesses which trade internationally are significantly more productive than their domestically focused competitors, women-owned businesses tend to trade less internationally. Women tend to run and operate very, very small enterprises, the micro, the small, the medium-sized businesses. This means that they are often underrepresented in international trade, as Miss disproportionately also face the highest cost in order to overcome trade barriers. There are also limitations around women's ability to travel, to access education, to access finance, or find contractual support. Helping to fix this issue will not only promote gender equality, but I also believe that it will unleash the potential of economic growth in our countries. And this is something we really truly need to change. And I believe that the WTO has a role to play, and maybe a key role to play. I want to see the WTO and its members work together across international and regional organizations to address these issues in a coherent and in a meaningful way. Now, based on evidence and context, Kenya has actually focused on just a few areas which have changed the way that women-run businesses operate. And they focus on a few critical elements, as I said: promoting women-run businesses in informal sector, promoting small and medium-sized enterprises, ensuring that market information is available and accessible to women, creating mandatory public procurement supply quotas, and I think you've all heard about this, that 30% of public procurement is actually reserved for women, for the youth and people with disability. It has been a game changer in our country, and it has set an example and a standard for other countries. I actually recall that when I was Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Trade, there were very many delegations from across the continent and beyond who wanted to come and look at how this actually works. We've also created institutions that enable women to access financing. So there are many women, funds that have been created. The banks have desks that support women entrepreneurship, and His Excellency President Uhuru Kenyatta has been very, very keen to make sure that we actually support women businesses and put a woman at the head of the work that's being done on Miss in our country. We have the Wezo Fund, which targets women. We also have the Women Entrepreneurship Fund that has also been set aside in my country to look at women financing. Now, it's also important, obviously, to connect women to global value chains, to increase women's competitiveness, and I think just in recognition to the evidence that's out there, that about 10 million of the world's small and medium-sized enterprises are owned by women, and that these SMEs account for almost 80% of employment globally. And so it's really, really important that we build the capacity of women to understand the rules, regulations, as well as their rights in relation to cross-border trade in goods and services. Since 2017, and I think that this is something that some of you may have witnessed in Argentina during the World Trade Organization's conference. It was the 11th session of the WTO conferences. The 10th one was held here in Nairobi. The 11th one was held in Argentina. But in Argentina, we came together as women to launch the joint declaration on trade and women's economic empowerment. And I can tell you that that was the most exciting event that happened during the Argentina ministerial meeting. I just remember what happened. All women standing in the balcony of what was the convention center. Just hundreds of women standing there and lifting up, this declaration on women in trade and women's empowerment, and standing there and making all sorts of noises that all of us make culturally in different parts of the world. It was a really significant and impactful moment. And since that time, we've seen a significant uptick in Geneva on the work around gender and trade. We have broadened our research agenda in Geneva, and I think the WTO has done really well. Last month, There was a joint publication on women and trade, we recognize the efforts of the ITC on the She Trades initiative. I think that you probably know about that. I have continuously supported and praised Arantxa Gonzalez for the amazing work that she did when she was at ITC. She's a friend of mine, worked together in Geneva before, and I'm really happy that she was able to do the work that she did. Let me also say that having done all that, we still have a long way to go. It will take a lot of dedication, it will take resources, it will take energy to just ensure that not only are these efforts and initiatives maintained, but that they're also expanded to reach more women traders around the world and level the playing field so that those who follow us are able to actually take it further. So this would be an integral part of my mission if I'm selected Director General of the WTO. However, there's a long list of challenges facing the organization at a point in time where the world needs it much more than ever before. I have said this on a number of occasions, including at the WTO General Council, that the WTO needs urgent reform, that it is in need of urgent reform. This is essential if it's to become, again, the center of a rules-based multilateral trading system. It's also essential to restore its role as an engine of growth, of jobs, development, and stability through trade. Reform is all the more urgent today because we need trade and the WTO to help us recover from the economic fallout and recovery from challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, looking further ahead, the WTO needs to renew its capacity to negotiate and to develop new rules and disciplines for future challenges like the digital economy and climate change. Turning to my experience, I served as Kenya's ambassador, as was just said, to the WTO from 2000 to 2006. During that time, I was elected successfully and successively to be chair of the Trade Policy Review, chair of the Dispute Settlement Body, and chair of the General Council. As Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Trade of Kenya, I chaired the WTO's ministerial conference here in Nairobi, where I'm at now, and that happened in 2015. This meeting produced, I think, until today, the most significant outcome for a WTO conference. We had Bali in 2013, where the Trade Facilitation Agreement was adopted. And then we came to Nairobi. The pundits had declared it a lost conference because the expectation was that there would be no result, that it would actually fail. Surprisingly, we had a very significant outcome, two big agreements, one on the prohibition of agricultural export subsidies, a negotiation that had taken 15 years and that was concluded in 4 days in Nairobi, and the information technology agreement, the expanded one, it's called the ITA 2, that was also negotiated and concluded here at Nairobi. In Nairobi, there was big power politics. Seriously, big power politics. Some of the big powers wanted the export subsidies prohibition agreement. Others wanted only the ITA because of the capacity, the potential that the ITA had to inject trillions of dollars into economies almost immediately. And so and I think somebody talked about, I think it was Andrea or Emily, about the green room. And I think that in Nairobi, and maybe we can do that during the Q&A session, but in Nairobi, I think we had one of the last green rooms, one of the last successful, green rooms. And that's why I truly believe that during negotiations at the WTO, we must have different configurations of bringing members together to negotiate without losing that very, very valuable element in WTO negotiations, which is basically transparency, inclusiveness, and non-discrimination, but also ensuring that decisions are made bottom-up, and that everybody feels included. So in Nairobi, we had those two major agreements, but we also had others. And we had discussions around the public stockholding. We had discussions around cotton and domestic support. We had discussions on other issues. We came up with a wonderful work program for the future work of the WTO, and we were all extremely pleased, almost unexpectedly, of the success that we had in Nairobi. I think beyond that, we went to Argentina. I think I talked about that before, and during the conference in Argentina, I was facilitating the agriculture negotiations, because the only success that we've ever had in agriculture happened under my chairmanship here in Nairobi. And therefore I was told, look, you have to take up this, be the facilitator for agriculture. Let's see whether we can move beyond export subsidies to domestic support, including cotton, public stock holding, SSM, and other issues. And we actually came very, very close. We came very, very close to reaching an agreement, but we were not successful because the whole conference was not able to make progress, and therefore it was impossible to make progress even in one area, except for the declaration on women and trade. Well, I know that I have what it takes to make the WTO successful, to revive it, to reignite its negotiating function, to make sure that, you know, what it was intended to be, a forum for multilateral negotiations, that actually takes place and happens. I know how to bring members together. I have done it, I think, throughout my professional life, when I was at WTO in Geneva, when I was here in Nairobi. I tried it also in Argentina, so it's something that I have continued to do. I also know how the Secretariat functions, because fortunately, I was privileged to chair many bodies of the WTO, and therefore was able to work with the Secretariat. I've engaged with ministers and heads of state and government in my career at different levels, whether it was when I was in Geneva chairing the General Council and took it to Hong Kong for the Hong Kong Ministerial, or whether it was after that as Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Trade, Minister for Education, and Minister now for Sports, Culture and Heritage. You know, I'd also like to comment on the education bit, because I think that during my time in the Ministry of Education, we were actually able to do amazing work for the girl child. Amazing work, including making sure that we had a mentorship program for the girl child, that we created safe zones for them, where they would be able to engage freely without any fear of being forced not to forced to be silent and not to speak about their hopes, their aspirations, but also their fears and the challenges that they face even within their home states. So that was actually one of the most rewarding experiences I had, to just make sure that the next generation knows that it can actually be safe, and that it can realize its potential and do what all of us, including Amina, Lisa, and Andrea, what you have been able to do, that every young girl knows that they can be able to achieve that. So let me conclude by saying this, that I'm running on my political experience, on my technical skills, and on my commitment to reform the World Trade Organization, and that my theme is the recovery, the reform, and the renewal of the WTO. Thank you very much.
Madam Ambassador, thank you so much. You covered so many of the critical areas and how we can think about the WTO, restoring its leadership in this space. I want to go back. There was such a great example as you talked about the agriculture negotiations. I mean, as all of us know, ag is always the most difficult component of any discussion. It's the last thing done in any trade deal. I'm curious, what were your lessons learned from that experience, especially as you think about getting to consensus on such difficult issues, and how that might apply to maybe renewing or updating the negotiation practices at the WTO, especially getting past this issue when you make progress, being able to capture that progress without getting blocked by the fact that there's not a complete and total deal, the conference itself not shutting down the good work on agriculture. What are some of the lessons learned we should be applying?
I think the lessons that I learned was that we must always insist on the core values of the WTO. And those core values make all the difference. It's about non-discrimination. So don't discriminate against any member state, because each member state contributes to the effective and efficient running of the multilateral trading system. But more importantly, they can stop any negotiation in its tracks, because its decisions are made by consensus in Geneva and at the WTO ministerial conferences. And so if one member is unhappy, they will just raise their hands and say, look, I don't accept this deal. And therefore there's no consensus. If they keep quiet, there is a consensus, because obviously consensus is not unanimity, right? So some members will not be totally happy, but they'll let it go because they want to exercise flexibility, in the interest of the common good. So I think that non-discrimination, transparency, making sure that everybody actually understands what's going on. So there are no gray areas. No member is out there saying, look, I don't know what's happening. I've been kept in the dark, right? And I actually know how that feels, because I participated in a ministerial conference in Brussels in the early 90s. I was a junior officer in the mission. And I went there, and I can tell you that one of the most interesting things was I never entered a negotiating room. We were all on the corridors waiting for 5 or 6 countries to make a decision for 100 plus members of the WTO, right? And so obviously, as soon as that decision was made and it was brought out, the rest rejected it, and the conference failed. So transparency is key for negotiations. Let everybody know what's happening. In Nairobi, I made sure that I left the green room and went to every and each group. I went to the African group, I went to the G90 group, I went to the G33 group, I went to the GRULAC group, I went to the ASEAN. I went to everybody and talked to them, CARICOM, and talked to them about the issues that were being discussed, and got their bottom lines and say, where are your red lines? What won't you accept? What would you let go, even though you're not totally happy with it, right? And so what's acceptable and what's objectionable? And I would go back now to the green room and say, look, this will probably pass. This will not pass. And so either we should go back and convince everybody, or maybe let's focus on areas of consent, areas where we can find agreement, the areas where we can move together. So that transparency is really, really important. And of course, inclusiveness. Make everybody feel that they're part of the journey, because they are in the WTO, they're members of the WTO. They came in for a reason, not just warm seats. So make it inclusive so that everybody feels that they were part of this journey, they participated in it, they own the outcome, and they implement it willingly without anybody holding a gun to their head. I think those are the key things that I learned in the ministerial, but also that the key decisions will always require different configurations. So you actually come up with a formulation, and then you test it on each of the other elements in the membership of the WTO. But bringing everybody along and making sure that those decisions are accepted by everybody, and that everybody leaves the table feeling not terribly disappointed, but feeling, I think, equally uncomfortable. I think that's basically the way to get it done.
Great point. And speaking of views and opinions about the WTO, Andrea, I know you've got a question. You've got such great data on how the public opinion views are. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question directly? Andrea? There we go.
There we go. So, well, thanks for your patience and bringing me back in. Yeah, Ambassador Mohamed, I want to pick up on what you've said about the green room and the transparency and inclusiveness, and extrapolate that and look at overlay it onto the way the American public feels. Right, we are at the moment in general very wary, very skeptical of international organizations. And as you said, that sort of human dynamic, if you don't understand much about what's going on, you tend to view things with a level of skepticism, even suspicion. And I think that is unfortunately the dynamic we have right now with the American public toward many of our international institutions. And we wanted to test this out. I run a website called Trade Vistas, which is a trade education website. And over the summer in July, you know, we almost had a vote in Congress on whether to leave the WTO. It was sort of a built-in mechanism when we implemented legislation to join the WTO that every 5 years we might consider this and take a vote. And that has never happened until this summer. But for some procedural issues, we may have had such a vote. And we can't take it for granted anymore that we would naturally dismiss such a notion. And so we polled the general public and asked them this question about whether they thought the United States should leave the WTO. And the results were that 2/3 said, yes, we should either leave the WTO, or they felt indifferent about it or unsure about it. And that worries me greatly. Even that indifferent category and unsure category worries me greatly. And I agree with you that, you know, we need to keep hammering this concept of transparency and non-discrimination, the fundamentals. But Americans clearly don't really view the WTO as fundamentally protecting those economic freedoms. And so my question to you is, what would you say to an American public, right? We're all practitioners and we're following the minutiae and the detail of WTO, and we obviously believe in its existence, its future. But for the American public, what do you say to convince them of the value of staying and also of the value of leadership in the WTO?
Look, I think that, and this is what I would probably say to them, that there was a reason why the WTO was founded. It was founded after the Second World War, when countries went to war to protect market space, when they went to war to protect economic interests. And governments around the world felt that they can't continue like that. They can't continue to fight, right, and spill blood for public space, that there was a better way of doing this. And that way was creating the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And they created a complete system. You know, I actually really commend the founders. I think that their vision was amazing. Mm-hmm. They created a complete system where you would actually go negotiate. And you know, you negotiate for rules because society is so dynamic. There are new things that are coming up every day that need to be displayed. E-commerce is one such area, right? And I think all of us agree now, I mean, we're communicating through technology. All of us agree now that e-commerce is only going up. That is not going anywhere else, mm-hmm. right? And so you need rules to display that. But this, you know, this governments felt that the way to do it is come together, negotiate, rule make sure that the multilateral trading system is a rules-based system. So that it's not people just guessing. It's not people assuming. It's not people getting cynical about the system, but you actually have rules which you must follow. And if you don't follow those rules, there was a dispute settlement mechanism which you could go to instead of going to war, right, and having thousands and millions of people killed and destruction all over, that you could actually go to a court, right, a dispute settlement mechanism. And you could have a panel make a decision. And if you're unhappy with the decision, you could actually appeal it. And if a decision was made that you were right, that your rights and obligations had somehow been interfered with, then there were sanctions. And you were allowed, right, to take action against that state using trade instruments, using tariffs, you know, and things like that, right? Or closing your market to some of their most attractive products. So they found a way around it, around not going to war to protect economic space. And I think that all of us need to protect that, right? That was something that they thought through. And they felt that this was the only way that they would stop governments, right, from going to war again over basically trading rights, trading spaces, yeah, and economic interests. And so we must continue to remember that there was a reason why the GATT and then the WTO were actually founded. And that the reasons were very noble, yeah? And that those reasons are still there. And the fears and the potentiality of having people go into conflict, yeah, to protect economic rights and to protect their trade interests, that is alive today. I mean, you know that and I know that. Yeah. That possibility really exists. And that's why we must protect this system, that our forefathers and America was in the lead of that process, as it was in the lead in the establishment of many of the other international organizations. You know, I don't think that, you know, you should ever throw your baby out with the bathwater. Not just a baby, but your baby, because that's your creation, right? You can't throw away your baby with the bathwater, right? I think that what you do is you throw out the dirty water and you use clean water, right, to make sure that the baby is clean, dry it, right, and dress it. And so if there are issues within the WTO that need to be addressed, by all means, I agree there are issues, there are concerns. I have my own concerns, even as an individual. Yeah, let's sit down and sort them out. That's what, you know, we should be doing. Yeah, let's fix the rules. If we think the rules are weak, let's strengthen them. If there are areas where there are no rules, like in e-commerce, let's sit down and negotiate. Yeah, and create disciplinary rules for them. Yeah, let's fix that which is not working for us. Yeah, because there is actually no better way to dealing with the challenges that keep arising around trade than within the WTO itself. It was actually a very well thought out product, and it's able to resolve the tensions, yeah, that arise out of, you know, trade disputes. It is able to do that. And actually, you know, the tensions that we have today, they're not the only tensions. I remember being in Geneva, and there were tensions like, for instance, around US and Japan trade. Yeah, and we sat down and they were resolved. I remember your trade representative, you know, walking into a room and saying, look, this is not going to work. We must find a solution. You know, either, we must continue buying each other's products, but we can't do that if there's such a huge imbalance. And we all listened to them. You know, things were put on the table very honestly and candidly, and there was a solution. And those tensions have never recurred. You know, so it is able to resolve these issues around the table. And I think, of course, it will matter who is the Director General of the WTO. Yeah, because I think you must understand what the issues are, and you must have some political skills to address them. Yeah, you must have done it before. You must have a track record of bringing people around the table to discuss issues that may be extremely controversial. You know, and yet at the end of the day, when you get that solution to the dispute, there is no better satisfaction. There's no, you know, just around the room, in the secretariat, in the membership, everybody's very pleased and happy that a solution has been found that will take us, you know, at least, you know, a distance. And I think the example I would give, and then I would allow another question to be asked, is the TRIPS agreement and the amendment to the TRIPS agreement. Yeah, and you know, we had a waiver that was agreed in Doha in 2001, and we went back to Geneva, and after a while, the HIV pandemic was basically just destroying everything and everybody. On the continent, we were losing a lot of very, very young lives. And I remember coming home for a holiday, I think it was in 2002, early 2002, and just going through hospitals here. And then I traveled to Uganda, and I went to hospitals in Uganda. And I came away feeling completely traumatized. There were too many people, you know, affected, too many people dying, and most of them were extremely young. So I got back to Geneva and started having discussions. First, there were informal discussions. And we started talking about how to amend the TRIPS agreement so that people could have access to affordable ARVs, to affordable medicine. And we weren't going to allow people to continue dying, and yet the treatment was available. It was there. But now we needed to strike a balance. And the balance had to be access to affordable medicine on one hand, IPR, right? And the protection of investment into research and development on the other hand, right? And how did we do that? We managed to convince, you know, the richer developing countries, right, not to be part of the deal. So that would allow the poorer developing countries who could not afford ARVs for their population to be part of the deal. So that we could actually bring down prices through compulsory licensing, right, and parallel importation. And we worked together. In the beginning, there were 5 countries. And of course, the biggest farmer is the US. And so we had the US ambassador, who was an amazing, amazing ambassador called Lynette Daly. And we sat around the table for 5 days and 5 nights. And at first we began with 5 countries, and the US on the other hand, and the EU. The EU accepted some of the conditions we put on the table and they walked away. And we remained with the US for a few more nights. At the end, it was just Kenya and the US that were negotiating. Yeah? And we managed to strike that deal. We got a waiver and an amendment to the TRIPS agreement. We've never had an agreement amended in the WTO since, and we had never had one amended before. It actually took a lot of skills. Not just on my part, on the part of Lynette. Lynette was an amazing US ambassador in Geneva. And we managed to strike this deal. And we are friends until this day, because really we spent very many memorable hours together, just looking at how we can be supportive of each other. I would support the investment in research and development and the protection of intellectual property rights. And she would help me find a way around the affordability and accessibility of the RV. So, so it's possible to resolve these issues, yeah? As long as you're all seated around the table and, the objective is to find a solution.
This is the pragmatic and very human dimension that a woman in this position will bring, right? I mean, this is where we need to keep getting back to, as you said, the values, yeah. Thank you for answering that question. I appreciate it. Thanks, Lisa.
Absolutely, and very much so. Staying with that theme of values, that's been one of the criticisms of the WTO in the last couple of years, is that there hasn't really been closing big negotiations, and that's fostered a rise in bilateral regional agreements that fight against that multilateral agenda. Now, as an optimistic person when it comes to trade policy, I would suggest you could look at that from the other direction too, the fact that there are still commitments. And for example, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. When you have that many countries across Africa, we know there's a lot of details that still need to be worked out, but they've made the commitment. They've stated the political will to drive to greater liberalization and maintain that commitment, even through these challenging times, the COVID response. They've still come out and stuck to the implementation date, even if that had to move to January. That commitment is something that really can be celebrated, and there's an opportunity for the WTO to bring up those initiatives, help build the capacity to align these types of, especially such a marquee, a landmark regional deal with the WTO values, core principles, and particularly a lot of the key negotiating objectives. How do you see opportunities, certainly in the role of as the new DG, to bring these initiatives to help elevate them, capture that commitment to trade liberalization in a way that's, in this example, good for Africa, a great way of demonstrating the tangible benefits of trade, maintaining that commitment, but also aligning it and being something that the WTO can then catalyze further progress? How do these work together?
Well, first of all, I just want to congratulate Ghana for having opened the Secretariat of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful step to have been taken by African countries. It's a lot of commitment, by the way, because right now we have the 8 regional economic communities. And we all have different policies and laws and rules, and therefore harmonizing that is a really big it's a very, very, very big commitment that has been made. But the leaders have made that commitment. It's the right commitment to make. Just imagine for a minute, there are 54 African countries. It's the biggest continent in the world. It has the largest number of countries. If all trade barriers were brought down, and that's the intention, and you create the biggest free market in the world, it's not just good for Africa. Yes, according to the World Bank, it's going to inject 450 billion, dollars into the economies of the countries in the continent, but it's going to inject half of that into the global economy, right? So it's good for Africa. It's also good for the whole world, for the globe, for the multilateral trading system. Barriers have been brought down. A market is open, the biggest market that you could have, of 1.2 billion today, but rising. a very young market, a very vibrant market, a very dynamic market, a very innovative market, because young people innovate. And then the opportunities that are there for big investors coming in to make sure that the logistics are right, making sure that the infrastructure is constructed so the continent is connected. It's not connected right now. It's not connected. So it's going to be big opportunities for big business, not for small business. Definitely for African business, but also for international business, for the multinationals that will come in and build the factories that are needed, the industries that are needed, the ports that are needed, the roads, the rails that are needed to just connect this continent. It's really good for the globe. For trade, it's amazing. I think that just bring up the standards of African exports into the rest of the world and within the continent. Today, intra-Africa trade is 15%. In Europe, the US, the Americas, and Asia, it's 70, 60, 50%. So imagine bringing that up from 15%. Even if you brought it up to 25%, just imagine the impact it will have, right, on livelihoods of people around the continent. Right? And then, of course, I mean, if the continent is impacted well, if we create wealth and prosperity on the continent, there will be less problems for everybody else. There will be less migration, right? Especially the illegal type. The impact that will have on the continent would be amazing. But the market it will open for the rest of the globe, I actually can't even begin to imagine it. I think it would be amazing, and I would hope and pray that I am there to see it unfold and to see it happen. Now, on regional trade agreements, they've always been there. We've always had regional trade agreements, and in many cases they complement the WTO. They don't take away from it because most of them are aligned to the WTO. Many of them are aligned to the WTO. What really happens is that a subset of countries come together and they feel that they want to go a little further, take on more obligations than the bigger group of countries, and they do that. And sometimes they also go into new areas. For instance, there are regional trade agreements that already have rules on the digital economy. Yeah, the WTO doesn't. Yeah? So now we can borrow from the regional trade agreements to have the WTO now look at the regional trade agreement and say, look, they have made much more foray and they're further ahead than we are. We need to cover these areas. We can't be behind the curve all the time. And so how do we come up to speed? We can come up to speed by looking at what others have done in smaller subsets of countries, borrowing from that, right? And having a multilateral negotiation. So that's what's happening right now. We have a plurilateral negotiation on e-commerce. It's the first time it's happening in the WTO, but if you went around the world, you'd find many bilateral agreements that have it, many regional agreements that already regulate, digital trade and e-commerce. So I think that in a way we complement each other. The multilateral complements, the RTAs, and the RTAs do the same. They inject a freshness, a newness into multilateral, trade negotiations. Today we have the plurilaterals on e-commerce, on domestic regulation, and on investment facilitation. Okay, look, we haven't had. Just imagine that we are a multilateral trading system, and we don't have disciplines and rules on investment. And most trade is based on investment from outside. Take an example of my country. There are a lot of sectors that actually have benefited from investment from outside. And therefore not having disciplines for investment facilitation, I think that was an oversight, and I'm happy that it's taking place now. Now, these are plurilaterals, so obviously they're not multilateral negotiations. Yeah? And what we did with the ITA in Nairobi, with the Information Technology Agreement in Nairobi, is we told the parties to that agreement that in order for it to get broad support and some consensus around the ITA, that what we actually needed to do is to tell all the members of WTO that the benefits that accrue from a plurilateral are going to be shared on an MFN basis with all members of the WTO. And guess what? It worked. In Nairobi, it did work. And so whenever I talk to members, I tell them, yes, it's fantastic that you have these plurilateral negotiations, but remember that at the end of the day, when you conclude those negotiations, what you need more than anything else is broad support. You need to bring down the walls, right, around these issues across the globe. Now, the way to do it is by sharing its benefits on an MFN basis, so that everybody wants to share the benefits and may necessarily not have to take on the obligations, but share the benefits. So I'm hoping that with the plurilaterals, if we're able to conclude them by the next ministerial meeting, yeah, that then we can make that statement loud and clear, that the benefits can be shared with everybody on an MFN basis, but also that we can have an open accession system so that countries, when they're ready, can actually jump on board. So that's what I would say to answer the question that you asked.
Thank you. And I know we've had a couple of kind of pulling together some of the questions that have come across the chat and being respectful of your time too. I know we only have a few minutes left, but you spoke so passionately about gender diversity and what trade can do to empower women, especially women in the global economy. With the principles of Buenos Aires, we recognize there's still a lot of cultural and in some cases, native protectionism efforts that have not allowed women to fully participate. What would be your agenda from a WTO practicality standpoint? Do you see ways for the WTO to really codify these legal protections, to take up these issues and create a real platform by which women have that standing to participate? And very specifically, do you see an opportunity to lead by example, for example, ensuring gender diversity in the DG cabinet?
Well, the answer to the last one is yes, absolutely and totally. That it's absolutely not okay to have a DG who's a man and 4 DGs who are men. I think that is not okay. It's a very bad representation of our globe. It's also terrible for what women's empowerment is supposed to be about. And it's also a negation, it's a rejection of the progress that we have made as women. So that is not acceptable. And I don't think that under my direction it will happen. So you have to help get me selected. It wouldn't happen. I can assure you that it is not right to have no woman in the hierarchy. It's also not right to have 5 directors out of 20 as women and 15 as men. I think that's also not a reflection of the journey that we have traveled together. So it's really important that I say that, because I'm always very upfront about it and I don't apologize for it. I think it's really important that we get that done. Now, on what we can do at the WTO, right? First of all, I think it's really important always that awareness is created, that people actually understand where we're at. We take stock of where we are and we look at the gaps that exist, and then we come around and decide how to fill those gaps, right? So I think that the public forum in Geneva, I think if we make it a point to have 2 of those areas and have one dedicated, right, to women in trade, and especially multilateral trade, and then get women organizations, I hope that you will be the ones who lead that, to have a serious discussion on where we're at, and then use the opportunities that are provided by the business dialogues, because we actually have roundtables. They haven't happened in a while now, but I remember them very, very fondly, where we used to meet with businesses around the table, and the ICC would lead it, so it was called the ICC roundtable. And at that table, we would then discuss, after having discussed with women groups, we would then come and sit down and say, listen, these are our challenges. Now we want you, as multinationals, to create a niche for women so that women can come on board your global supply chains, your global value chains, right? Make that your corporate social responsibility bit, yeah? And work with the WTO, but also with ITC, with UNCTAD, with UN Women. Bring all of them together, right? Come up with a coherent policy, because really fragmentation will not work for us. We have to have coherence, yeah? We must all know what everybody is doing, so that then we can decide, okay, and actually measure how far we've come, what we are doing, how well we're doing, how bad we are doing, what the challenges that we may have. So we should use the opportunities that are present. Yeah, and I think that we can upscale all that. We can upscale the awareness creation in the WTO, have serious events that are dedicated to this, talk to business and create niches where the women can be supported, build capacity, and that we can do within the WTO. There are resources for that. Build capacity of women entrepreneurs, right? Give support, give technical support to them. So that they learn about what we just discussed. They need to know about standards, about rules, about regulations, about systems, about what the market is like, what it's about, how to access financing, right? And what that takes. What are the obligations that come with financing? Because obviously it's not a grant. Yeah. So I think we can do all that using the resources that are available in the WTO, but also bringing the resources across the world that can be available to women in trade, from the IMF, from the World Bank. Just create the coherence, make the WTO the center of global trade governance. Because if it's women in trade, you are talking about trade governance. So let's sit down, right? Have the WTO at the center, right? And with that centrality, bring everybody around the table. I think we will make such strides that have never been seen before, that all of us have been thinking about, by the way, but we haven't had the instrument to be able to deliver that, the vehicle to deliver that. So listen, I want to be your vehicle to do that.
Your Excellency, that is such an empowering message, and I think being very respectful of your time, great words to end on too. I will admit personally, professionally, that's one of the reasons why I've always been such a big supporter of Women in International Trade, our WIT DC chapter in particular, and our global parent, the Organization of Women in International Trade, who have chapters in Geneva and Nairobi. We're a community, and that community can really be a force to empower the agenda you're discussing, the messages you're putting out. Having been to a number of those business dialogues, it's a natural thing. We come together and there is a fantastic group of women really driving the progress, the actionable nature of those discussions, not just talk for the sake of talk. And I feel that's the role, that is certainly talent you would bring to the role of Director General. We wish you every success in your campaign. Count on us as the community that really welcomes your leadership in this space. Certainly the incredibly impactful agenda that you've talked about with us here today. It's been such an honor for us to host you. I know I speak for the entire group. We've been thrilled and inspired by your comments, and we look forward to making this an ongoing relationship, as you continue to lead and drive such a progressive, empowering trade agenda. So thank you so much for joining us, and we can't wait for the next opportunity to talk with you about next steps.
Well, thank you. Thank you very, very much. As I always say, and I said in 2013, half of the world is women, and the other half was born by women. And so I think that we should be able to cultivate that goodwill that comes from those that we bear and those that we are, to make sure that we can move this process forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody for joining us today. We will be posting the discussion up on WIT's YouTube channel, and we look forward to discussion and engagement with Her Excellency, Madam Minister Amina Mohamed. Thank you again.